Good morning, all. Thank you for the intro. Don't worry about the headsets. There is no rehearsal and no jokes, so laughing not required. It's a bit of a heavy topic for first thing in the morning, but I promise that I will keep it as light and as bright as I can. And in fact, what I'm going to talk about is, in 20 minutes, it's ambitious, a century of British political advertising, something that always, or at least every few years, clamours for attention. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons that we can all take from this once every 4 or 5 years circus, roadshow, national happening. And apologies if over the last few weeks you've had enough of political advertising, because you're about to see quite a lot more of it in the next 50 or so slides. Now, I'm going to focus on British political advertising over the last century and the lessons that we can take from it. And you may wonder, why am I standing up here? What right do I have to even address you about this topic? Why am I here today? And the simple reason, really, is that a few weeks ago, our Prime Minister was at the D-Day commemorations, the 80th anniversary of D-Day in France, but decided to leave that event early to go have a chat with the telly. Turned out this wasn't his best idea, and in fact, the following morning, really across all the front pages, regardless of creed or class or political affiliation, there was a real sense that Rishi had let the nation down, that this was perhaps not the best judgment call or the best thing to have done to honour those who'd served 80 years earlier. I'm Australian, not British, but even I know how fundamental to not only British sovereignty, but to the British psyche an event like D-Day is. And so to have walked out on it seemed like a real own goal. And of course, the papers had plenty to say, and I always love, one of my favourite things about writing in Britain is the way that newspapers sum up national moments and national events. Of the many takes on what happened, this was probably my favourite. But that morning, I decided to put my own take out into the world, because sort of sat on the loo that morning, scrolling Twitter infinitely as the day starts, I had my own thoughts about what had happened and my own reaction to it. And as a result of that, I mocked up this poster. Not a real poster, and I was very clear when I put it out into the world to let people know it was not a real poster, but it was a real reaction to a real event. And it turned out that it got quite a real response. I posted it on Twitter. I'm not big on Twitter. I've never gone viral on Twitter. I didn't really know what happens when something blows up or does the numbers. But I learnt on that Friday what happens when that happens, when you get that sort of sudden attention to something that you've put out into the world. And the Twitter thing was kind of rumbling on, and it wasn't until the next day when I got a WhatsApp from a mate saying, my stepdad put this in our family WhatsApp group. He doesn't really give a shit about what I do. He doesn't care about advertising. But my stepdad sent this back to me, and then I Googled it, and it turns out it was you. And this weird thing started to happen, that this piece of work started to come back to me from Facebook, from Reddit, from Instagram. And it sort of found and took on a life of its own from Twitter and far beyond. So within that sort of 24 hours after the post, it got millions of impressions and was suddenly out there, and I sort of became my own social media manager for about 48 hours, which was a bit of an odd experience. And as a result of this, I started to dig into British political advertising because it sort of piqued my interest in some of the things that have come before and what they've meant to sort of key, decisive turning points in the country. And when I mocked this particular poster up, I had a very particular reference point in mind, which you may already be able to see from the art direction, and that is the seminal 80s poster by Saatchi and Saatchi for the Conservative Department. For the Conservative government, Labour isn't working. It is a brilliant piece of advertising and one that has truly stood the test of time. It is iconic, that overused, but in this case, much deserved word. So this, and I sort of tried to put this morning's presentation together by taking my own politics out of it and sort of looking objectively at the best and worst of what's been said and done over the last 100 years. And this really is, I think, the pinnacle of British political advertising, and indeed up there with the best of British advertising. I also stood on the shoulder of giants because, yes, referencing an iconic piece of work in the art direction, but the words, he left them on the beaches, clearly echoing Churchill's own words from decades before, And Churchill always spoke about standing on the shoulders of Shakespeare. In fact, he was known to write his speeches out in the form of sonnets because he wanted them to have that sort of lyricism and that quality and that sort of that level of writing and of craft. And so it's not hard to write a good headline when these two guys have written it before you. And I started to think about the way that words can echo down the decades or down the centuries and really stay with us today and really have the ability to continue to command our attention, to live rent-free in our head. And in fact, it got me thinking about the fact that words really are our richest resource, but also our cheapest tool. They don't require a crew of 50. They don't require a huge tech build. They don't require months of post-production. But how often do we see them doing the work and the heavy lifting that they really can do? How often do you sit in a film and think, I wish they'd spent $10 more on the script before they spent 10 billion on the explosions? And I think getting back to the fundamentals of great copy and great writing is something that I think is a good lesson to take out of this morning if you take anything. And remembering that words are 26 letters, endlessly rearranged, and forever free. And I think their power should never be forgotten or underestimated. And in fact, looking back at the history of political advertising, the 80s, the relationship between Thatcher's Conservative government and Saatchi was the first time that a political party and an advertising agency had professionally worked together. This was the first time that one had been commissioned to work with a government in office. And there's a slew of amazing bits of copy. Predominantly, it was a very typographic approach. The Labour Isn't Working has stood the test of time, perhaps more than others. But there are so many great pieces of writing and of simple crafted art direction within that really sort of iconic period of work from the 1980s. And looking at the time, Maurice Saatchi, my own old paymaster, is quoted as saying, "Posters are to politics what poetry is to literature. The only possible words in the only possible order." And I love that honor of the craft of the writing that's gone into these. I think it's a great quote. So I started to look at other examples where words have and have not helped their cause. And that took me to the 2016 Brexit vote, Remain versus Leave. And really I can sum this up in 2 slides and 4 words, because that's what the campaign came down to. On the Remain side, Remain was the word. And someone very cleverly thought, oh, look, there's the word in at the end of Remain. That's the idea. That'll do it. And for many people who woke up that morning to discover it did not do it, that sense that this campaign rested on its laurels or took something for granted really comes through when you look back at it, at really the minimal amount of effort that went into creating and crafting a sense of emotion or belonging or desire or need. Conversely, on the Leave side, we had 3, I think, quite brilliant words. Take back control. Just 3 words. Brevity does not mean you cannot be emotional, but incredibly, these really captured a feeling among a vast swathe of the nation. And this wasn't just take back control of our borders or of our sovereignty, but it cut really to the man and woman in the street, that sense of people who felt out of control, disenfranchised, disillusioned in their own life, a sense of take back control of their life, their house, their family, whatever it might be. It really traveled right through British society. And I think also the power of just it being written in the vernacular made this a really powerful statement that cut through all the Remain in wordplay you might be able to throw up against it. And indeed, in looking at this, you see that keeping it short is always great. 6 words on a poster, that's the rule. He left them on the beaches, 6 words. The shorter you go doesn't mean the less emotion or the less clout. Brevity is the soul of wit, but you need to have the wit. And I think keeping that emotion in there, no matter how tightly or how crisply you craft your words, is really important. If we cut to this election, we've lost some of that. This is one of the battle buses, as they're known, driving around. As this one says, clear plan, bold action, secure future. It's hard to even bother stressing any of the words. This is not so much advertising as it is PowerPoint for all of the emotion, for all the way that it grabs you, for all the way you might even begin to remember it. And I think that it's interesting when you look at something like that and go, that for me is really the nadir of advertising. You see so much of it out there, though. I promise you, if you look around on the tube, if you look around, you will see bullet point advertising everywhere, particularly in B2B. But it really isn't the way that we reach out or that we respond as humans. And in fact, that reductionist view of copywriting has reached, I think, its bottom. I promised you this would be very neutral, in one word. That's what we've gone to. Now, I understand the strategy of if you don't have to say anything, don't say anything. The more you say, the more you can be taken down for. But to be so ridiculously reductionist as to arrive at a single word, change, does feel somewhat like a missed opportunity and somewhat like there's nothing there to say. And indeed, that is often some of the issue that's being leveled at the Labour Party, that there isn't a policy, that there isn't a story. One word isn't going to do it, despite it being a desirable one for many. Now, something else is happening in this picture, and you can see it on Keir's lectern and up in the corner there, and that is that glimpse of the Union flag. And we're seeing it more and more, almost to an American level of flag waving through this election. And it cuts across the parties. So here we have Keir, here we have Rishi, here we have Nigel, all really the same shtick here, the same background, the same Britishness, almost a full circle loop back to Britannia, this sense of Britain as glory, Britain as empire, Britain as ruler. That's what's being evoked when this is brought up here and being pushed out in this way. And if we go right back here to 1906 in this case, another conservative political ad, this time it's Britain's hopes being dashed. Good ship Britain against the choppy seas of free trade. There's always been this sense of protectionism, of island nation that gets called to mind and evoked in these moments of national importance and of political decision-making. It's something that we're seeing now in these moments and that we were seeing then in these evocations. The art direction's gone downhill, perhaps. And a lot of this leans on some very old words. We go back here to 1595, so I promised a century, but we've ducked back 500 years here, to one of the best, from Richard II, one of Shakespeare's best speeches. And there's something quite interesting when you look at these words and the way that they have echoed down through the years, and they remain a touchstone for patriotism, for nationalism, for pride. And in fact, here, 1595, all of these words summed up in 2019 in these three. Somewhat pithier, but perhaps lacking the romance that Shakespeare had put into them. But this sense of capturing that moment and that national mood does still come through, and you can see what it's drawing on from years gone by. The flag, again, being used to great effect here. And in fact, if you have a look at our world post-Brexit, you see the flag is doing a lot more heavy lifting across the political spectrum, whether that's GB Rail and the logo here, the announcement of Great British Energy, or indeed any government body that's rebranded in the last few years seems to mandatorily take a corner of the flag and make it their icon. There's something quite interesting about this. And what does this mean for everybody else? What does it mean if you're working at a brand or at a business? Is this a rise of, is it patriotism? Is it nationalism? Is it xenophobia? Is it racism? What are the things that are being encoded here? What are the things that the nation is thinking about that you should be thinking about, and who in your organization is thinking about them and noticing these trends? Because this really is about widening your view of the world you operate in, beyond a competitor review or a competitive set, to think about the social, religious, political, economic, sexual, cultural, national, global landscape. What are the things that are going on, and are you aware of them? Do you have in your team someone who's as likely to vote Green this Thursday as vote Reform? Do you have someone who listens to Radio 4 and someone who watches ITVB? Have you got that sort of breadth and depth of British society reflected in the diversity of the way that you think about your communication problems and the way that you go to the world? And these things aren't just about looking around at now and the future. Trends often focus on now and next. But actually understanding why things are the way they are and how they've been encoded into culture can help you do that thing that we all want to do, which is to make a dent on culture or break into culture or have work that becomes a part of culture. You have to understand culture and how it's been built over days, decades, centuries to become a part of it. And actually, again, looking back at advertising, if we go to, this is 1939, outbreak of Second World War, there were 3 pieces of work created by the then Ministry of Information. This was one of them that ran quite a lot around Britain. This was the second that ran in those early Second World War years. And the third one you'll know much better than the previous 2, and that's this one here. Not so much an ad as just sort of a statement of British identity, that sense of blitz spirit, that sense of keep buggering on. It's all here in this. But this ad never ran. 2.5 million of them were printed. They were kept aside as the third execution for particular atrocities during the Second World War, ones that thankfully did not play out. And at the end of the war, 2.5 million of these were pulped. It never went out on the streets. It was never a part of that story. As much as in our heads, it's very much that story. And one turned up in a bookshop in 2000, and it kind of caught fire from then and has become now a part of national identity that might be 2000 plus, but can't be separated from Britishness. And in fact, it has been wrangled, mangled, distorted, destroyed, tea-toweled, printed, reprinted, put on mugs. You've probably owned one, gifted one, or thrown one out in your own time. But this is what it means to be part of culture. This is something that is so far from its roots as a piece of advertising as to become a true piece of national identity. And if you want to become part of culture, you have to be okay with the things that culture might do to you. Culture does not care for brands or brand guidelines. It will absorb, regurgitate, and play in the way that it wants to. And being part of culture might mean becoming a naff tea towel, but that's what it means to become a part of culture. And one of the reasons that I think this piece in particular has transcended the world of advertising so brilliantly is its positivity. There is, despite it coming out of the darkest times, it says something about our resolve and our spirit. And actually, one of the accusations leveled against political advertising, and indeed the one that I put out, was that it focuses on the negative. And can't we have some hope? And can't we have some joy? And can't we have something to want and to desire? So I had a look through the history again of the last century of advertising to see what I could find. I found two. This one here, don't just hope for a better life, vote for one, with a smiling Maggie Thatcher. And this one here, with a grinning Tony Blair. And I kind of learnt why maybe there aren't more of these. There's something more unsettling and more unnerving about a politician grinning at you from a poster than there is one perhaps grimacing. And in fact, Tony Blair certainly learnt his lesson, because that grin was co-opted and twisted by the Conservative Party to become the devil eyes poster, as it's known, for New Labour, New Danger. So perhaps there's a reason politicians no longer smile in photographs, because things like this might happen to them. And actually, another interesting thing about this poster is we've gone beyond words here. New Labour, New Danger is a great line, but the art direction here is what nails it, the devil eyes. And what is the thing that goes with the words that really makes it truly iconic? What is the image that really nails and solidifies that language? That's the bit that can really help it to nail into culture. Here's another interesting example. Sorry to pick on Mr. Blair, but the Blair poster originally came out in this weird IKEA homage when there was a U-turn on tuition fees. It then came out a couple of years later in response to the Iraq War. Completely different art direction. No one remembers this, and I suspect if that had been all that ran, no one would remember it, because the line is great, but the art direction just does not land it. Only when it ended up with the bloody bullet holes did it become the piece of cultural communication, the artifact in design museums as it is today. That powerful combination of, in this case, one word, but that word is a bit more than change, but with a really powerful emotional graphic. And there are lots of examples of advertising that dispense with words altogether. Often there are visual tropes in the history of advertising. The idea of sort of puppets and puppet masters and kings and kingmakers comes through quite often. From this example here with Ed Miliband in Alex Salmond's pocket, to this one here, you can see that that sense of sort of puppets and puppeteering is a visual that's been used time and again in political advertising. And again, one only last week. Which I think just goes to show when something becomes a norm and a trope, you can't do it better, and it's probably best to move on, because this is just a bit creepy. But there are a lot of ads that are in the current campaign that recall one's past. This could be an ad running in this election. It's not. It's from decades ago. But you see those repeating narratives and those repeating tropes, those things that you go back to and say again and again, because that's how to encode and embed thoughts and attachments in culture. But these are all examples, again, of people taking potshots at each other. And if politicians are busy arguing between each other and taking each other down, again, the charge is, what are they really doing for us? What are they telling us about policy? What are they telling us about our future? And there's a great British get-out in all of this, and that's that you can get away with a lot more when you make it funny. And humor in political advertising is something that has been used to great effect. And I've got a couple of examples. I really like this one. It's the only example of a political ad I could find that's sort of self-effacing, self-deprecating, has that sense of someone's character and being okay with how that's seen, owning it, and turning it into a positive. This was a piece of work actually created by M&C Sartu, and it was part of a campaign that actually didn't run in the end. So there are a wider selection of them. It was prepared for a snap early election that didn't get called. And there's actually a whole bottom drawer of pieces in this one that's quite interesting to dive into. And they're quite interesting because they do the same thing that Devil Eyes did. They do the same thing that Blyer did, but they do it with a lightness of tone that makes them maybe more palatable. And there's something interesting about, it's always a bit of a risk. Do you take on the competitor in your advertising or not? And it really does come down to tone, and I think it's interesting looking at this other end of the spectrum. It brings me to this piece, which is, again, I think a great example of the use of humor in advertising. Here, William Hague's face with the spectre of Maggie Thatcher with the wig and the lipstick. And this particular piece was actually created by Trevor Beatty, and when it was first shared with Tony Blair, he laughed and said, "We can't possibly do that. We can't say that." And Alistair Campbell said at the time, "You laughed, that's why we can say it. It's funny, therefore it doesn't matter how negative it is. Funny makes it okay." And it went on to run to great effect. And actually, looking at this and bringing up to the end of this presentation, this is, for me, a poster that looks like a meme. I made a meme that looks like a poster, but this is a poster that looks like a meme. It's got the sorts of things and the sorts of kind of visual approach and language that we're used to seeing shared across X, across Facebook, across Instagram. And that rise of meme culture as a comment, as a way of communicating, memes as a language, I think is really interesting. And in fact, this face mashup was one of the many face mashups that's come out during the last couple of weeks as we approach this Thursday. And looking at the world of political memes as communication, this is the rise of a new form of language, one that does come from and travel through culture incredibly successfully. How many brands are willing to let their guidelines go, let their structures go, let their logo go, in order to become something or someone that travels and becomes part of culture? And I actually think when I put this grid together of sort of current and past political memes, it's got a lot really to overlap and in common with the paid political advertising. It's quite lo-fi. The images are quite cheap. It's all in the copy most of the time. But this is powerful, low-budget campaigning and low-budget advertising, and great lessons to learn from that to take into a brand's world. But if you take one thing from this here parade of memes and this parade of successful political advertising, it's that emotional intelligence, sensing the mood of the nation and being in tune with the mood of the nation is the fastest way to make work that travels across the nation. And I think if you remember two letters from the last 20 minutes, I would say EQ is the uniting glue of all the work that I've shown, whether that's a social media meme or a piece of political advertising from the last century. So I will leave you with those two letters and a reminder before you come here on Thursday morning to whatever your colors, your stripes, your allegiances or affiliations, to go and have your power and cast your vote. Thank you all.